Greetings, humans. I don't know why I said that. Peace and welcome back to the channel. So, as promised, I am here to have a deeper dive into the magical properties of water. We're going to talk today about why and how water acts as an amazing, just tiny little microchip for sound information, for physical information, for visual information, emotional information, all kinds of information. Water has the ability to store and transfer it. And today we're going to talk about how and why. And I do want to preface that by saying a lot of this information is yet to be understood because people are afraid to dive into the realms of information that are not readily available. Thankfully, there are some incredible men and women that are still foraging forward with the study of water and its mechanisms. And I want to talk about what I have found when I started trying to go a little deeper into why something like holy water would work, why, sound healing works in some instances, or even just on a simple basic level. How is this material that makes up 99% of my body on a molecular level, how and why does it work the way that it does? And I will say, looking into this, it just really reminds me how much information we have access to when we are brave enough, willing to look deeper than what our five senses can tell us. Because what I'll say is, since humans have been recording history, water has been a huge part of, ceremony, of ritual, of daily use, like besides just needing it on a basic level because we need water to live. When you look at ancient texts, when you look at mystic texts, spiritual texts, water has it's held to a really high esteem. And even when you talk about coming, into more recent times, scientists that were able to groom themselves in their practices rather than having to go through an institution in order to come out on the other side and call themselves scientists, there's a history of their work kind of explaining on an intuitive level how and why water has this ability, this amazing ability to store and transfer information. And I want to bring that up because as of right now, it seems like science is the end all be all of information. But what reality is showing us is that information that you are able to gather intuitively is incredibly potent and powerful. And science really can only come in and prove what it is that you already, like internally are kind of thinking along those lines already. And that's something that I really hope catches your attention, especially right now, because like I said, scientists are given this like different level of authority as far as explaining how and why and what people should be doing. But in reality, intuitive information is a way more vast pool of, see that pool of knowledge and information that you can tap into once you choose to do so. That intuitive information is readily available to you at any given moment, second, millisecond. Now, that's not to discredit science, just to maybe put it in its place a little more in your mind. So anyways, say all that to say, as of right now, based on the tools that we currently have access to, science has been able to come up with a really accurate hypothesis of why water has that very unique property. And it all comes down to the fact that individual water molecules are polar. Those individual polar molecules create these larger molecules that have a crystalline structure. Just like the crystalline structure that is used, like the quartz crystal that is used in electronics like your phone, computer, watches, to store and transfer electronic information, water does the same thing. So that's pretty much how they're able to kind of put two and two together and figure out. We don't know exactly everything that's going on, why it happens, but we do know that just like the crystal quartz that we use to store and transfer digital information, electronic information in our technology, water makes similar structures just naturally, just by itself. So I pull out my handy dandy whiteboard. Anyways, so what do I mean when I say polar molecule? Now, before I start, they have worked hard to convince you that only scientists can understand science. It's not true. Take a deep breath with me. You can understand this. I will do my very best to make sure it makes sense. So, when I say that water is a polar molecule, what I'm saying is that just like batteries, it has two poles. It has a negative charged end and it has a positive charged end. Those are the two poles. So that's why water is a polar molecule. So I drew out on an atomic level what one molecule of water would look like, H2O, right? Let me see if we can get, oh, that looks great. Okay, so there's my key here, and you can see our protons are in this purple, neutrons, which have a neutral charge, are in black, and then our electrons, which have a negative charge, are in blue, and the protons, positive charge, right? So this larger molecule that you see here, this is oxygen, this large one here. This is the nucleus of the oxygen molecule. It has 8 protons and 8 neutrons, which means that it also has 8 electrons. And you see those organized, they kind of organize themselves loosely around the nucleus of the of the oxygen molecule. Now this is really key because the main two factors that make water a polar molecule are, one, Coulomb's law, which has to do with the charge of an object and its closeness to another object with a charge, and then the octet rule. So I'll explain what both of those are and how they relate. So as far as the octet rule, it's been shown that in general, most of the elements that are crucial to organic life, such as photosynthesis, breathing, the factor that drives those reactions forward is the fact that many of these elements like carbon, nitrogen, sodium, oxygen in this case, they want to have a total of 8 electrons in its outer energy orbit. So this one here is the first energy orbit. The second one is the second energy orbit. It wants to have 8 electrons here so that it can be stable. And I want to highlight that in numerology, the number 8 symbolizes active independence. So it symbolizes the fact of going from being a part of the whole to stepping out on your own and being your own individual expression, or your own individual entity. So I think that's a beautiful reflection, right there, just how mysticism and how the hard sciences can overlap and reflect one another. But yeah, octet rule. So in the second energy orbit, oxygen only has 6 electrons because the other 2 are in the first energy orbit, right? So since it has 6 electrons, it wants to have 2 more added so that it can feel stable. That's where the 2 hydrogens come in. If oxygen is in the presence of hydrogen, then it's going to want to take on 2 hydrogen atoms in order to be stable, in order to be complete. So that's what we see here. We have H2, there's 1, there's 2, 2H, H2O. So that explains the octet rule. The octet rule explains why it even wants to have that reaction in the first place. Now, Coulomb's law explains more so of why it ends up being positive on this side, negative on this side, right? So oxygen has a higher electronegativity than the hydrogen. Electronegativity is just an element's ability to hold onto electrons or to pull on electrons. And so oxygen has a stronger pull on the electrons than the hydrogen does. So hydrogen's electrons that it is contributing to this water molecule is held really tight and close to the nucleus of the oxygen, more so than it is the nucleus of the hydrogen. And the reason that makes a difference is because with hydrogen's electrons being pulled so tightly to the oxygen, it leaves its proton kind of on the outside here. And since the proton has a positive charge, then it will make sense to you that there's a positive charge on this end of the molecule. On the side of the hydrogens, you're going to have a slight positive charge because its protons are the most exposed, are the most available. Whereas on the opposite side of the water molecule, you have nothing but electrons. Electrons carry a negative charge. So that's why this end has a negative charge. And you have your polar molecule. And like I said, this acts a lot like a battery. And so if you didn't know, the way that batteries actually work is that they convert chemical energy into electrical energy. Literally makes the current be active. It pulls the energy along the current in the circuit. And that's what water does as well. Because it has that negative and positive end, it's able to move frequency, to move current. And because it has that ability, you can kind of think of when you're putting batteries in the back of your remote or whatever the case, how you have to have the opposite ends face each other. Water loves to do that with itself because of its polarity. And that's what ends up making these larger molecules, because the individual molecules want to interact with all of the individual molecules around it because they're all polar. So what that means is the positive end of this one water molecule is going to want to react with the negative end of the molecule beside it, and vice versa on the other side. The negative end wants to interact with the positive end of the molecule beside it. So what that ends up doing is making these larger molecules. Like I said, I will refer to these as macromolecules, but you can see that. So this is pretty much a zoomed in version of these. So these are all individual water molecules, and they are bound together. You can see the oxygen and the hydrogen as one molecule, but they bind to each other with the hydrogen positive end of one molecule to the negative oxygen end of the molecule beside it. And based on a few different factors that I would love to cover, if you all are interested, let me know. But based on that, you end up getting these six-sided honeycomb figures because positive wants to interact with negative, negative wants to interact with positive. And that also explains why water has such a high surface tension, because its individual molecules are so readily available to interact and react with one another. So yeah, grab my notes, make sure that I didn't miss anything. We talked about the Coulomb's law a little bit. We talked about the octet rule. What else? Oh, okay, so this larger molecule that I showed you down here, this is the crystal. I mean, it organizes in a lot of different ways, really. So in nature, just based off of the activity of the sun and the magnetic current of the earth, these larger molecules that water forms, they don't really have a defined, definite organization. It's kind of pretty neutral. They're just together. So if you look at one just droplet of water, there are countless number of these individual molecules, but most of them, rather than just floating around as individual molecules, most of them are tied up in making these larger structures because of its polarity. And it's based off of what you introduce to the water that will dictate what this larger molecule ends up looking like or shaping itself to be or look like. And depending on what that shape it takes on, that's going to dictate what information it's holding, right? Hopefully that made sense so far. If not, I would love to answer any questions that you all have. I just want to make sure I don't go too deep. I don't want to lose you. What else? So that's how and why water does it. It's polar. Because it's polar, it wants to react with each other and make these crystal structures. These crystal structures, just like any other crystal structure, like the quartz in your electronics, can store and transfer information. So that's what science has been able to figure out so far as to why water has that unique property of being able to store and transfer information. Right, so what else? Make sure I'm not missing anything. Oh, something that I found very interesting is that like the larger molecules that are created, they listen to the most dominant frequency introduced. So if you were to introduce something and it doesn't have enough force, it doesn't have enough influence to change all of the water molecules out of their orientation, that larger molecule will revert back to what it was before. And I find that really interesting. Think of what it takes to make a change. You have to kind of flood the system with whatever it is that you're trying to reprogram it to have. It's not enough to just do a little bit here and there. It takes a substantial amount and a concerted effort, a consistent effort to actually generate lasting change. And I'm just blown away over and over again how looking at water is this very clear reflection of us and our experience, our conscious experience. Like I said, science still has a long ways to go to fully understand this unique property of water, but this is where it has found itself at the moment. Now, another thing I wanted to talk about, those structures are mad stable. Now, they're not permanent because, like I said in the previous video, there are ways to make water lose its macromolecular structure. Some of the things that can make it lose that structure is, in nature, water follows the path of least resistance. But when you're taking it through a water system or municipal system, it's constantly being shot up, shot down, right, hard, like 90-degree angles. Things like that throw electrons out of the system. And once you do that, you're changing the charge. And so you're changing the entire way that the molecule is able to be structured. And thankfully, you are also very easily able to restructure the water based on, what information you bring back to it, because naturally it shapes itself in these hexagonal figures. Okay. I know that some of you may notice that I am in a different outfit, and I figured I should just be transparent and be honest and let you know that it's because I'm from the future. No, I'm just fucking with you. No, first part of the video was beautiful, but I had a camping trip to go to and I wasn't done editing it. And if I have to choose camping over anything, I'm gonna choose camping. So here we are. Shall we pick up where we left off? So like I was saying right there at the end, that's pretty much the why and the how as far as we know it, as far as science has been able to show so far about some of the unique and magical properties of water. I'd love to talk now about some of the current research or the current work being done in this field I found that when I was trying to do my research to organize this talk, it was pretty much impossible to find any primary source literature on these subjects, which was super annoying. But I did go ahead and purchase Dr. Carly Newday's book, Water Codes, and Dr. Gerald Pollack's book, The Fourth Phase of Water, because I had read excerpts from Dr. Carly Newday's book back in college, which is when I even got into the idea of water and molecular memory and things like that. But I hadn't read the whole book, and so those are on the way. So that's just a heads up. This is not the last you will be hearing about this subject, because it. I mean, I knew, but I didn't really know, and there's still so much more for me to understand and learn on the subject. Um, I would say the main question I'm left with a couple questions after my search so far. For example, I'm a little hazy on the idea that, okay, water holds memory, but when it's exposed to certain things, then it loses its structure, so it doesn't carry memory completely, or does that mean that it erases everything that was there before? Like, what is the extent of that memory, and how does it, transform from one phase to the next? If you heat the water and then freeze it, and then, whether it's in a cell or outside of a cell. I'm really curious about the whole extent of its memory and how it works. I think that's my biggest question, because there's some data that's showing us that aquatic life that are exposed to some of the outflow water from water treatment plants and different industries, that the marine life there are showing signs that they've been exposed to all of the things that were supposedly treated for within the water treatment process. For example, pharmaceuticals. So there's no specific straining of pharmaceuticals from municipal water as of right now, but it is chemically treated. It is treated with extreme heat. It's strained. There's a lot of processing that it does experience when it's being cleaned. How clean is water that you poop in? Anyways, so they're finding really like trace amounts of pharmaceutical drugs like birth control, antidepressants, just from being, excreted through our waste, and that goes through into the water, and those drugs are ending up in water systems. But they're finding them in trace amounts, so like a dilution of 1,000,000,000,000 times plus. So it's like, okay, if I'm looking at Dr. Benveni's study, I'm like, okay, it makes sense that the water could hold on to that information, but then at the same time, I'm knowing that it's gone through water treatment. So it's like, did it lose its structure that would be able to carry that memory? I'm not 1,000% sure. I mean, but in a lot of these studies, a lot of the time they're looking at sea bass. And when they're looking at them, they're watching them display completely bizarre behavior that's counterintuitive to their survival in cases where they've been exposed to antidepressants, to a point where they are swimming so high, like close to the surface of the water, that their dorsal fin is exposed. I mean, you're making yourself a lick at that point. So it's like there's nothing else they can ascribe that behavior to except for their exposure to these antidepressants. Prozac was a big one that they were finding. I mean, but they're trace amounts. And there's been studies where, actually, this is really sad, a lot of the male bass are becoming hermaphrodite, where they're having both sexual organs, both sexual reproductive organs, and they're not even able to have successful reproduction because of their exposure to hormones and birth control. So it's like, okay, I get that they're dilute, but they've gone through this process that should have changed the molecular structure and memory of the water. So that's something I'm curious about. And then two, when you think about, I mean, the water doesn't give you dysentery if you collect it from a regular, random stream and boil it and treat it properly. You don't get sick from it. So at some point, it releases that information. And as far as I know, we haven't even figured out those answers yet. But those are the main questions that I'm left with. Figured I'd be honest because that's what a good scientist does. And so hopefully things will be more clear to me once I get those books. I cannot wait. And let me just tell you a little bit about their work, just a little bit. So Dr. Gerald Pollack, I'm like a little obsessed. An amazing professor, an amazing scientist. This man is on the record saying that, structured water could revolutionize the entire way that we look at healthcare, the entire way that we look at, energy mechanics. It really blows the lid off of everything that we've discovered up to this point, especially because it makes up 99% of our bodies on a cellular level. Huge deal, right? But it takes a lot of courage to step out of the herd and, talk about something that's not fully understood yet. Again, that's what a good scientist does, though. So shout out to Dr. Gerald Pollack. So he's one of the people that is really pushing forward the idea that water has a fourth phase. So usually you think liquid, crystal, or liquid, solid, so like ice, frozen, whatever, and gaseous. But what he is really pushing for people to understand is that the water that is within your cells and within cells, period, the substantial makeup of cells is the structured water. That's the water in the hexagonal shape that I've been talking about. And that water in that arrangement has properties that are not covered in our study of liquid water or our study of solid water, because it's not quite either. It's like a liquid crystal. It's like a gel type of texture, and that's incredible when you think about the properties that water displays, such to the point that he is being able to show that the pressure that our heart generates to pump our blood and move it through our body doesn't account for the full mechanics of our blood flow. That a huge part of why our blood is able to flow, especially through smaller capillaries in our body, is actually due to the activity of structured water. Because when the water is structured in that way, it sets up a gradient naturally, and that gradient brings motion into the system. So hopefully that makes sense, but to break it down, one of his experiments involved taking a tube of a certain material. It's got to be hydrophilic, meaning that it can interact with water, it likes water. So he submerges that tube in the structured water, and he has actual video evidence, watching a flow, a current form in that tube, a current. So when something goes into motion, it needs energy. It needs an input of energy in order to go into motion. Otherwise, the laws of nature follow the path of least resistance. So that means if I can chill, that's what I'm going to do. So unless there's energy introduced into the system. And so he's seeing that there's nothing in the system that he's created except for the structured water, the tube that he submerged it in, and, tiny molecules to kind of track how the water is structuring itself. And he's able to see that it's taking in energy and it's converting that energy into motion in this case. What they were able to figure out is that the energy input for that system is none other than light. Light. Now think about what that means. The water that's inside of your body, which is structured hexagonally in sheets and layers, responds to light in order to absorb energy and convert it into whatever the case. In this case, we're talking about mechanical motion, physical motion. That means I'm not going to put words in his mouth because I want to be careful with that. But what that implies, guys, We're not so much different from plants. And somebody like me, oh, I screamed, I squealed when I read that, or when I heard that. I was just like, what? We photosynthesize to an extent, like not quite because we don't have chloroplast, we don't use chlorophyll, but just the fact that the substance that makes up most of our body on a cellular level is responsive to light. And that makes me think of a conversation that I had like years ago. And at that time, I was like very stuck in my head about I'm a scientist, I only look at this, that, and the other. But a person brought up to me the fact of some enlightened beings being able to subsist off of light alone. They don't eat, they just absorb energy from the sun. And I immediately was just like, we have to stop this conversation because you sound ridiculous. We don't have chloroplast. And I had to eat my words recently because what this information implies is that the water in our body is receptive to sunlight. It does convert light energy into electrical energy, physical energy, whatever forms of energy. That's amazing. I hope that you find that amazing as well. So that's a big part of what his work is about, is just really breaking down the physical characteristics of this fourth phase of water, because this fourth phase of water is how it exists in all the cells, all organic living cells. They are comprised of structured water. To the extent that he's saying the actual structuring of our cells and the organization within our cells is dependent on that water being in that crystalline structure. And that kind of leads me to Dr. Carly Newday's work, which really highlights the idea of water having or carrying or being capable of consciousness, and also talks about how our cells, when they are healthy, they're showing this structured water. If you know that your cells rely on structured water to that degree, then we can focus some of our preventative health care on maintaining the structured water in our bodies, in our cells in the first place. And that's important because structured water actually acts as a natural antibiotic, natural antimicrobial, because of the high organization of those macromolecules. It excludes things that do not belong. So Dr. Gerald Pollack, that's his work where he's really expanding on the exclusion zones, is what he's called them. The zones that structured water creates around it as a kind of perimeter to keep out certain things and to keep in certain things. So, I mean, just imagine that, as far as even viruses, we're talking about it excludes viruses, it excludes bacteria, it excludes certain protein. That is definitely something worth looking into when it comes to preventative health care. And the beautiful thing is this work is helping us to understand really specifically a long list of things that help water take on that structure. So some of the things are light. It seems that the infrared spectrum is the most efficient at organizing structured water, specifically at, I think you said 3.0 micrometers, at that wavelength specifically. Sound has an effect on creating structured water. As far as food goes, coconut oil, turmeric, what else? Apparently words as well. Now that's the part that gets tricky because the work that Dr. Masaru Emoto did, it's always looked down on because he did something called cherry picking with his data points. So that's like you look for the best looking ones. But the thing is, his work is still has been corroborated by research that's come after him. So I accept that as pretty factual. But I understand and have respect for the scientific process. That's why I'm excited that this work continues. I'm just so aware of the fact of my body being this water mechanism, like the plants that I surround myself with, the plants, period, all the plants, like my food that I eat, it's all made out of water, and not just any old water, structured water. And structured water has all of these incredible properties. Like you can think about the chakra system and how in this phase, in that fourth phase of water, light is reflected at different wavelengths based off of the shape that the macromolecules are taking on, right? So it's just like if you had any doubt before in these techniques that our ancestors knew about, and I don't just mean like, long time ago. I mean our grandparents and great grandparents. Like, I don't know about y'all, but when I grew up, it was always like, oh, your head hurt, drink some water. Oh, you can't poop, drink some water. Oh, you mad, drink some water. Like, to some extent, on a very innate level, we know that water plays a whole different role in creation. And then I've been seeing more and more those cute water bottles that have crystals in them. I think rose quartz is the most popular. And it's amazing because before this work was available, definitely before it was talked about openly, um, it'd be hard to understand why something like that would work. But hopefully, it makes sense to you now that crystalline structures carry information, water can take on crystalline structure. And so, if you were to put those two technologies together, you could understand how something like that would work. Another thing that I've been seeing, well, something that I've always just kind of intuitively known is I speak to my plants, I sing to my plants, and I would say, I mean, mainly it's because I really love them, but also I've always noticed, and my grandmother, I mean, my grandparents grew their own food, and so that was just as much a part of gardening and farming as weeding was speaking to the food, speaking to the plants. Um, and now they have music specifically for plants, for plant growth, actually. And I have been using that for years just because that's just me loving on my babies. Like if I go out of town for a weekend, I'll just put that on a loop for them to listen to while I'm gone. And I have seen literally one on my ZZ plant, it had a sprout at the time of me leaving for a weekend. And when I came back, first of all, it was huge. And it has gone on to be the biggest stalk on that whole plant. It's a good 4 inches taller than all of the other branches. And on the subject of plants, that's been a huge area of research in this field because think about the fact that without a nervous system, without eyes, without any of the senses that we would think would be required in order to sense light, in order to sense sound like ears, plants respond to these stimuli without a nervous system, without any of the things that I just mentioned. And they're finding out that the reason that it's able to do that is because their cells are full of structured water. And structured water holds all of these amazing properties, as in being able to respond to light, being able to respond to sound. That's why you'll see a plant, moving around a room or growing, in a certain way, depending on what type of music that you expose it to. And that's actually research that's been highly substantiated for a while now. I hope to break down a lot of the stigmas that are around, some of these practices that have just been called strictly religious or spiritual, esoteric. They are all of those things, but they are also so real that now that we have more of the tools to measure it, we can go back and prove what the Bible says about being able to turn water into wine, about being able to manipulate water and its properties to such a high extent. It's not, just theoretical for me anymore. It's like, this is so real. It's the realest thing ever. So yeah, I highly recommend looking this information up. You do have to do quite a bit of digging. Like I said, it's really difficult to find information that's just based on fact and objective data rather than people's opinions on the subject. That's why I'm getting the books, because I want to look at the experimental process of finding this information out so that I can help defend it. Damn it. But yeah, that's all I have on the subject. There were a couple interesting symbols that stood out to me when I was looking into this. So the number 3 kept reoccurring. Like I said, it's at 3 micrometers of infrared light specifically that has the one of the greatest effects on structuring water. And what else? The individual molecule of water, H2O, takes on a triagonal shape, which is 3-pointed. And the number 3, that's representative of the Holy Trinity, of the Divine Father, the Divine Mother, and the Divine Child, or just, the idea of 1 + 1 = 3, the idea of creation, the idea of divinity itself. That was a reoccurring number and symbol that I was seeing when I was looking into this. And in numerology, the number 6 represents, it's dead center of the mental plane, and it represents integrating the right and left hemispheres of the brain. So you could think of creation and destruction embodied here. And that goes on to make you think of Metatron's cube, or think of the Merkaba, which that's exactly what it's representative of, is that transmutation that happens, that ability to perceive as above, so below. On a molecular structure, water embodies that symbolism. And you could think of, the property of water as the purifier, that which can convert. Think about the fact that, at a steady pace, water can cut through any dense material. So yeah, those are a couple of the things that came up that I just wanted to point out that stood out to me from the perspective that I approach this work with. And I can't wait to learn more. I can't wait to discuss more with you all. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. What else? I think we're going to cover sound next, which I'm super excited about. So be on the lookout for that. And I'm supposed to tell you to like this video and subscribe to my channel so that the next time I post, because knowing me, I'll be somewhere camping for a couple days, and that's the only way you'll know what I'm up to. So I'll talk to y'all next time.